Picture the iconic image of General George S. Patton, standing in his Jeep, ivory-handled revolvers at his hips, binoculars raised. He is watching a lone American GI sprint across a shattered field to single-handedly silence a German machine gun nest. The general lowers his glasses and delivers a perfect, cinematic quote about the indomitable American spirit. It is the ultimate Hollywood framing of the Second World War. But combat is rarely engineered for a camera. When we strip away decades of propaganda, memoirs, and silver screen mythology, is there an actual, documented reality behind this legendary scenario? To find that reality, we have to look past the general and focus on a specific rifleman in the mud. His name was Private James R. Hendrix of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion, 4th Armored Division. The date was December 26, 1944, the climax of the desperate drive to relieve Bastogne. We are not relying on battlefield rumors or post-war memoirs to reconstruct his actions. We are anchoring this investigation directly to his verified Medal of Honor citation. By breaking down the exact topography he navigated and the suppressive fire he drew, we are asking a much larger question. This isn't simply an inquiry into whether George Patton was physically standing on a ridge, with a pair of binoculars watching this specific soldier. It is a forensic autopsy of infantry tactics. We need to understand how the mechanical reality of small unit combat actually functions when an entire armored formation is suddenly paralyzed by concentrated enemy fire. The mythology tells us that sheer courage is enough to break a stalemate, but the historical record demands we ask, what actually happens on a brutal, tactical level when a fast-moving armored spearhead slams head first into a solid wall of lead? To understand that wall of lead, we have to place ourselves directly on the ground in the Ardennes during the final week of December 1944. The 4th Armored Division was the primary spearhead of General George S. Patton's 3rd Army, driving relentlessly north to break the German encirclement of Bastogne. But an armored division is only as fast as the terrain it occupies, and in this campaign, the environment itself had become a hostile actor. Temperatures had plummeted well below freezing, hardening the mud into jagged ruts that shattered tank tracks, while heavy, continuous snowfalls obscured the topography. A thick layer of winter overcast grounded Allied tactical bombers, stripping the advancing Americans of their greatest asymmetrical advantage, close air support. The mechanized infantrymen of the 53rd Battalion were forced to operate in a frozen, colorless vacuum, completely exposed to a heavily prepared enemy. The German defenders standing between the 4th Armored and Bastogne were not fighting a desperate, disorganized retreat. They were executing a textbook defense in depth. In the narrow valleys and dense pine forests of Belgium, the Wehrmacht utilized the landscape to bottleneck American armor, heavily mining the few passable roads and zeroing in pre-registered artillery fire on the vital intersections. But the absolute anchor of this defensive network was the Maschinengewehr 42. The MG-42 was an engineering marvel of industrial warfare, capable of firing up to 1,200 rounds per minute. Its cyclic rate was so violently high that the human ear could not distinguish individual gunshots. It sounded like the tearing of heavy canvas. German tactical doctrine was fundamentally different from the American approach. While a standard United States infantry squad was built around the riflemen, a German squad existed almost entirely to feed, position, and protect the machine gun. When deployed in overlapping, interlocking fields of fire, these weapons effectively created an impassable geometric grid of suppression. They did not just target individual soldiers, they mathematically denied entire acres of terrain. When the M3 half-tracks of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion hit these defensive lines, the reality of the Ardennes immediately fractured standard United States military doctrine. The textbook American tactic was fire and movement. One element lays down a base of suppressive fire, while another maneuvers to the flank to destroy the enemy position. But fire and movement requires communication, visibility, and mobility. In the deep snow just miles from the Bastogne perimeter, all three evaporated. When the lead elements came under sudden MG-42 fire, the infantry was forced to instantly dismount and hit the dirt. The freezing mud locked them in place. The cold was so severe that the lubricants in their M1 Garand rifles began to thicken and jam. Worse, the standard SCR 536 handy-talkie radios carried by platoon leaders failed catastrophically. The sub-zero temperatures rapidly drained the dry cell batteries, completely severing the squads from company command. Without radio contact, forward observers were blind and could not call in the 105mm howitzers of the armored field artillery. The infantry was suddenly deaf, mute, and pinned against the frozen earth. This tactical paralysis collided directly with an immense, unforgiving operational pressure raining down from the high command. Miles to the rear, in a heavily guarded headquarters, Patton was operating on an absolute, non-negotiable timeline. He had publicly promised General Dwight D. Eisenhower that he could turn his entire army 90 degrees and relieve the 101st Airborne within a matter of days. Inside Bastogne, the paratroopers were critically low on ammunition, surviving on a dwindling supply of medical plasma and facing imminent collapse under concentrated German artillery barrages. Patton's orders, transmitted strictly down through the 4th Armored Division's command structure, demanded continuous, aggressive, forward momentum. There was no authorization to halt, dig in, or wait for clearing skies. The tempo of the operation was driven purely by strategic necessity, entirely ignoring the logistical constraints, the mechanical failures of the radios, and the physical limits of the men bleeding in the snow. This created a lethal paradox on the front line. The generals demanded speed, but the German machine gunners dictated the reality on the ground. On December 26th, as the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion approached the final ridges separating them from the besieged paratroopers, this friction reached its breaking point. Entire platoons found themselves trapped in open, snow-covered fields, pinned down by interlocking streams of tracer fire. To stay in the snow was to slowly freeze to death, or be destroyed by the inevitable German mortar barrage currently zeroing in on their coordinates. But to stand up and execute the relentless orders from high command meant stepping directly into the cyclic rate of an MG-42. The chain of command was broken by dead radio batteries. The armored support was stalled on heavily mined roads. The textbook manuals offered no solutions for a squad immobilized in the freezing mud without artillery support. The massive mechanized machinery of the Allied advance was suddenly reduced to a total standstill in a frozen Belgian field, forcing an impossible question. How does a paralyzed, isolated unit resume a seemingly suicidal advance when all modern tactical infrastructure has completely collapsed? That answer did not come from a strategic manual or a high-level headquarters. It came from the frozen dirt outside a small Belgian village called Assenois, just miles south of the Bastogne perimeter. On December 26th, as the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion pushed aggressively forward to maintain Patton's impossible tempo, the snow-covered tree line suddenly erupted. Hidden German positions, deeply entrenched and camouflaged, unleashed interlocking arcs of machine gun fire. The coordinated combined arms assault collapsed in seconds. Infantrymen dove into icy ruts, and the critical armored spearhead, the vanguard of the entire relief effort, ground to a violent halt. Private James R. Hendrix and his platoon were instantly pinned in a lethal crossfire. There was no heavy armor rolling up to suppress the bunkers. The Sherman tanks were bottlenecked on a narrow, mined approach road. There were no tactical adjustments coming from a distant commander. The radios were dead weight. The platoon was physically trapped. The German gunners only had to maintain their suppressive fire and wait for their mortar teams to dial in the coordinates of the pinned Americans. Hendrix recognized the fatal geometry of the stalemate. He understood that lying flat in the snow was not a survival strategy. It was a guaranteed death sentence. But what he did next was entirely divorced from the reckless, screaming frontal assaults of cinematic mythology. A wild, upright charge against a prepared MG-42 is mathematically impossible. The weapon's cyclic rate will cut a man down before he can cover 20 yards. Hendrix acted on immediate tactical necessity, relying on the microscopic details of the battlefield. He broke away from his paralyzed formation and moved alone into the lethal zone. Instead of rushing the gun directly, Hendrix began a methodical, agonizingly tense navigation of the landscape's dead space. A machine gun fires in a cone, creating a grazing trajectory that sweeps horizontally above the earth. To survive it, a rifleman must locate defilades, the subtle, natural dips in the topography, shallow agricultural drainage ditches, or jagged artillery craters, where the stream of lead passes mere inches overhead. Whenever the German gunners traversed their fire, Hendrix dropped into these frozen depressions, crawling through the mud to exploit the blind spots in the enemy's visual field. He had completely abandoned the relative safety of his squad, severing himself from coordinated covering fire. Inch by inch, he worked his way forward through a landscape saturated with live ammunition. He was no longer a cog in a mechanized machine. He was a solitary rifleman, methodically closing the distance, positioning himself just outside the peripheral vision of the German crew to strike the blind spot of their defensive line. By utilizing the shallow folds of the frozen earth, Hendrix managed to close the distance entirely undetected. His first objective was a German 88mm anti-tank gun emplacement that was pinning down the battalion's supporting half-tracks. The 88mm flat gun was one of the most lethal weapons in the German arsenal, but it was designed to destroy armor at long ranges. The crew operating it was intently focused on the distant tree line, scanning for the blocky silhouettes of Sherman tanks. Their heavy gun shield offered protection against shrapnel from the front, but it severely restricted their peripheral vision. This created a fatal tactical paradox. A crew trained to destroy heavily armored vehicles a mile away was entirely blind to a single infantryman crawling through the snow 20 yards to their flank. When Hendrix finally rose from the defilade, he was completely outside their field of view. He did not yell a warning or hesitate. He leveled his heavy M1 Garand rifle and fired precisely into the gun pit. The sharp, rapid cracks of the American rifle shattered the crew's focus. Cut off from their own infantry support and realizing their massive weapon could not traverse fast enough to engage a target at point-blank range, the surviving artillerymen immediately recognized their vulnerability. The German gunners threw up their hands and surrendered. In a matter of minutes, a single rifleman had neutralized a heavy artillery piece that a tank company could not. But this isolated victory was only a fraction of the problem. A secondary German position, a camouflaged machine gun nest, was still laying down a murderous volume of fire, keeping the rest of Hendrix's squad paralyzed in the mud. The German defenders in this second pit were seasoned troops. They were explicitly trained to counter massed infantry assaults, taught to lay down interlocking bands of fire that would chew through entire platoons attempting to cross open ground. But their doctrine, much like the 88mm crews, had a systemic vulnerability. It relied on targets presenting themselves in numbers. When a lone rifleman maneuvers independently through the dead space of a battlefield, the entire calculus of the defense begins to unravel. The German gunners in the second nest heard the crack of the M1 Garand at the 88mm position and immediately traversed their MG42. They were actively searching for a squad, a coordinated assault element, moving in to exploit the breach. What they saw instead was a single American moving aggressively across their flank. This completely disrupted their target acquisition. They struggled to pinpoint Hendrix's precise location against the snow and shattered trees. Their initial confidence in their impregnable position rapidly shifted to confusion and then to acute anxiety as they realized the American was not retreating. Hendrix recognized that the machine gun had shifted its attention toward him. He understood precisely what this meant. He was no longer trying to silence the gun quietly. He was now actively functioning as a human diversion. By aggressively advancing on their flank and drawing their direct fire, Hendrix forced the German gunners to abandon their suppression of his pinned-down squad. The interlocking fields of fire that had paralyzed the American advance shattered. The lethal geometry of the defense was broken not by overwhelming artillery, but by deliberately redirecting the enemy's cyclic rate onto a single, moving target. The immediate result was exactly what Hendrix had calculated. As the MG42 tracers snapped over his head, the rest of the 53rd Armored Infantry Battalion finally had a window to move. The crushing weight of the suppression lifted. Infantrymen pushed themselves out of the freezing mud, raised their rifles, and resumed the advance. The stalled vanguard of Patton's relief force lurched back into motion. Hendrix had single-handedly broken the tactical stalemate, but the cost of relying on this type of decentralized, individual action revealed a much darker, systemic reality about the American war machine. The operational momentum of Patton's Third Army was not just fueled by gasoline and logistical superiority, it was subsidized by a brutal, deeply flawed manpower policy. By late December 1944, the American infantry was suffering from crippling attrition. To keep the armored divisions moving, the War Department relied heavily on the individual replacement system. Instead of rotating entire exhausted units off the line to rest and rebuild, the Army fed raw, inexperienced draftees directly into active combat zones to plug the gaps. These green recruits often arrived at the front in the middle of the night, without knowing the names of the men in their frozen foxholes, let alone the intricate geometry of squad-level tactics. The casualty rate among these replacements was catastrophic. Consequently, the actual mechanical execution of the war fell squarely onto the shoulders of a shrinking, exhausted corps of surviving combat veterans. Men like James Hendrix understood a grim tactical reality. The rookies simply could not be trusted to execute a complex flanking maneuver in deep snow while under the cyclic rate of a German MG42. If a machine gun nest needed to be neutralized to save the platoon, a veteran had to do it. The entire mechanized thrust to relieve Bastogne effectively hinged on a tiny fraction of frontline infantrymen who were forced to consistently violate their most basic human survival instincts. They absorbed the extreme tactical burden because the institutional system provided no other alternative. But exploiting the terrain and acting as a human diversion to shatter the enemy's interlocking fire only works until the dead space runs out. Hendrix had successfully shifted the German machine gunner's focus away from his pinned-down squad, but in doing so, he had deliberately made himself the sole target of a seasoned enemy crew. As he closed the final yards to the second German position, the meticulous calculus of maneuvering through defilades completely evaporated. There was no more cover. There was no more room for tactical geometry. The question was no longer how a lone rifleman navigates a battlefield, but what happens when the distance drops to zero and the sterile logic of suppression devolves entirely into the chaotic, point-blank reality of close-quarters combat. That point-blank reality was not a cinematic duel. It was a desperate, uncoordinated struggle fought in freezing mud. According to his official Medal of Honor citation, Hendrix abandoned his final defilade and charged directly at the second German emplacement. He closed the remaining distance so rapidly that the gun crew could not track him. At the edge of their trench, completely exposed, he leveled his M1 Garand. The citation is stark in its description. He neutralized the position, personally silencing the crew with his rifle at close range. But the engagement did not end there. The sudden collapse of the two primary German strongpoints severely fractured the local defense, but the tree line was still saturated with secondary enemy fire, and the frozen field was littered with American casualties. His citation documents that Hendrix, despite remaining the primary target for the surviving German riflemen, repeatedly turned his back on the enemy. He moved out into the open kill zone, physically dragging his wounded comrades back to whatever shallow cover the ruts could provide. He did not issue commands, and he did not wait for a medic to navigate the suppression. He operated entirely outside the formal command structure, functioning as a one-man assault element and a frontline casualty collection point simultaneously. The momentum of the entire Bastogne relief effort in that specific sector, the advance of an entire mechanized column, hinged not on Patton's strategic brilliance, but on this one rifleman's capacity to process extreme violence without shutting down. He had to maintain absolute tactical coherence while completely isolated from his chain of command, systematically destroying strongpoints and hauling bleeding men through the snow. By the time the engagement concluded, Hendrix had neutralized two hardened artillery positions and physically pulled his squad from the brink of annihilation. The local German line buckled, allowing the heavy M3 half-tracks to finally lurch forward through the shattered defense. The immediate tactical paralysis was broken, but the brutal mechanics of how that breakthrough was achieved forced a stark reevaluation of the American advance. Months later, George Patton would indeed stand on a formal parade ground and personally pin the Medal of Honor to the uniform of James R. Hendrix. That much of the legend is a verified historical fact, but the cinematic image of the commanding general standing on a ridgeline, orchestrating or even comfortably witnessing this type of brutal micro-engagement in real time is pure historical fiction. The true documentary value of Hendrix's official citation is not that it validates a Hollywood myth. It proves the exact opposite. It reveals that the massive, highly publicized victories claimed by generals and high headquarters were ultimately underwritten by decentralized enlisted men operating completely blind and alone. The American military machine did not break the German encirclement of Bastogne because of a flawless strategic timetable or an inspiring speech. It succeeded because an exhausted private in the freezing mud understood the lethal geometry of a machine gun cone better than the men drawing arrows on a map miles to the rear. When the cold drained the radio batteries, when the armor stalled on mined roads, and when the doctrinal manuals offered no solutions, the entire mechanized spearhead relied on the capacity of individual riflemen to execute complex, high-risk tactical maneuvers completely out of sight of the command structure. The history of the Second World War is frequently told from the top down, focusing on the movement of armies and the brilliance of generals. But the reality on the ground on December 26th dictates a different understanding of the war. It demonstrates that true operational momentum is not generated in a sterile war room. It is forged in the dead space of a frozen field, by isolated men who were forced to absorb the systemic failures of their own military apparatus just to keep the machine moving. The industrial might of the United States delivered the Sherman tanks and the artillery shells, but the operational timetable of the entire Third Army ultimately depended on the lonely, terrifying mathematics of a 19-year-old soldier crawling through the snow.